Uncovered Culture, and our featured guest tonight is Mr. Mubarak, who is the writer, director, and producer for his featured film, The Way We Were. Welcome, Mr. Mubarak.
I thank you very much, Hazel. It's glad to be here all the way from Los Angeles. I feel very privileged to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. Mr. Mubarak, can you tell us a little bit about this film, The Way We Were? It's a much anticipated film, and I know that you're one of the finalists for the uh, Georgia Petries International Film Festival. Tell us a little bit about this film and what it's about.
Absolutely. I would be definitely gracious enough to do that. I went to Palisades High School, which was a what do you call it, integrated school in the 80s, and it was actually among the top five integrated schools in West Los Angeles that basically allowed for a lot of us here in the hood in South Central LA to be able to go to that school and attain better resources and education than our local home schools could provide during that particular time. I attended a high school reunion about 3 years ago, and during the conversation, which is part of the opening of the script, we went back down memory lane like most people do during reunions, and we talked about the differences between now and back then, and how we had reached this sort of high point of the integration efforts following the civil rights movement, and how we had benefited and how we see a lot of our kids aren't benefiting nearly as much. So we sort of, graveled with that, and I decided, you know what, that really needs to sort of be highlighted in a film, because I think that a lot of people are unaware of how different the approach to integration is on the West Coast compared to like Boston, with all the riots, and down south in the Carolinas and in Alabama. And things were just done here a lot more sort of cloak and dagger and much more sophisticated. And so I thought to myself, well, I think that story needs to be told so people can kind of see through a different lens how they're being handled, especially during the 80s, when the voter turnout was probably the lowest in California's history, especially among Black and brown folks. So we were not as politically literate as we are now, for sure. But I think just knowing and having that knowledge of how you're being handled and how you're being treated without knowing is really important to be exposed. So the story itself it really circles around two brothers, Val and Sid Ridgway. Now, Sid, the older brother by 3 years, he attended a segregated school in East Los Angeles. A lot of people are very familiar with Jordan High School. Jordan High School during the 70s was considered a control group school, where they would not allow that school in particular to be integrated. He attended that school, and of course, with all schools in the hood, especially during that period, they experienced severe overcrowding. And with overcrowding, you get an infestation of people that want to faction off into gangs, and then of course the gang violence sort of took over. And then you had, coincidentally, we just interviewed George McKenna. Denzel Washington made a movie about George McKenna, the George McKenna story, and he pretty much gave us the full Monty on how things really were, how bad things really were. But at the same time, he didn't really encourage busing, because he felt like we needed to sort of all just stay and deal with what was happening before us. So of course, there's pros and cons to integration and to the busing. I myself, I am a first generation busing recipient. And so my story obviously comes out in the younger brother's role in the film. So Val is the younger brother who, of course, after the older brother is subjected to a lot of the street life, the single mom, decides to move across town and allow the younger brother to be able to be bused and participate in the PWT program, which I participated in. I'm a first generation recipient.
What does PWT stand for?
Yes, so permits with transportation. So that actually came into full effect in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1979, Alan Robbins, who was the congressman Republican out of San Fernando Valley, had put on the ballot Proposition 1, which was against mandatory busing. So for a good stretch of from 1971 all the way to 1980, you had a lot of white kids being bused to black schools in the hood.
Wow.
Yeah, and so a lot of people don't know this history, and it's really important to sort of show that as well in the story, and then to understand why it was fought against mostly by San Fernando Valley politicians, Roberta Weintraub, Alan Robbins, Bobby Fielder. They were all, except Alan, they were all members of the board of Los Angeles Unified School District. And you also had members of the San Fernando Valley also a part of the LA City Council. So you actually had two bodies working in concert with each other to basically thwart and control integration efforts that had come out of the civil rights movement. And Diane Watson, she was the only African American woman during that time on the Los Angeles Unified School District Board. And so she really had a lot against her when it was, trying to support and continue to integrate Black and brown faces throughout Southern California. So the younger brother and the older brother, they get into this whole big rivalry. Mm-hmm. And because the older brother doesn't like the fact that his younger brother is sort of, he's listening to alternative music and he has white friends and, he's dancing. He's not really down with the streets per se. And so that sort of, reaches a pinnacle. It reaches a boiling point between the two of them. And it's later revealed in the story that the younger brother holds the older brother responsible for their father's death, which in fact, it is partly his responsibility that his father died, because his father was trying to prevent him from being killed, and he ended up getting killed himself through gang violence. Wow. Right. So that happens, and then of course, the younger brother, who really was attached to his dad, has always held a chip on his shoulder and resentment towards his older brother. But as the story goes, now, I'm going to preface the rest by saying that I have created two different stories because there was a special request made that in addition to the script for a feature, that I also do a 6-episode pilot for a TV series. So, and she told me, she said, well, you want to make sure in a series you're able to decompress the story, give more detail and development to the story, add more characters to the story, and take it even higher. So I ended up doing that. So now we've got not just the feature film, but feature story, but we also have a series, a 6-episode series. So so it really sort of expands on a lot of the different modalities of what was happening in the city. Of course, the end of the story, at least from the feature film side of it, is an incident that occurred that you could probably find on Google in 1988, January of 1988. There was a woman who was killed in Westwood by accident. It was the first drive-by gang shooting that happened outside of LA urban environment. So Westwood is considered like a very ritzy, upscale area, and most of the shooting that had gone neglected for years was happening in the inner city. Wow. And so when this incident occurred, what inadvertently happened was you had a major push from not only Chief Daryl Gates of the LAPD, but also from the Home Society. It's like a home association, realtor association society, uh, and the university itself. They all made a concerted effort to not only increase racial profiling by over 300%, but they also put in curfews. They changed the busing routes so people that lived in the inner city could no longer bus into Westwood as a weekend hangout. They closed down all of the clubs that most Black patrons that would go and party and have a good time on the weekends could go to. And so all of that was sort of a resuppression of a lot of Black folks out of those areas of town back into the hood. And
Okay.
so it sort of has that, it has a very sociological feel to it, because it's painting a picture of how we've been treated from a policy point of view. And I thought that it would be creative to do that. And I think there's been quite a few among the sort of Black cinema filmmakers. Obviously, Spike Lee is probably one of my favorites, and I look up to him a lot, especially Do the Right Thing. He used a lot of similar, like almost like policy-driven approaches to how we saw each other, and we were sort of molded and crafted to look at each other, the jigaboos and the wannabes and all of that.
Mhm.
That also plays a role in being bused versus going to your home school.
Yeah.
So that was really big, because if you lived in the hills in LA, you were 9 times out of 10, you were probably bused to a white school. But if you
Wow.
lived in the flat, then there was probably going to be a likelihood that you had a little chip on your shoulder because you weren't being given the same opportunities as those kids who were getting bused. And
Wow.
those that lived in the flats and were bused, they were sort of caught in the middle. So it was really three different sort of segments of the Black community that basically had fences up against each other
Do
because
you,
of
do you
this
think
this dynamic.
do you think there was a hidden agenda uh, outside of doing the desegregation in South Central LA? Like, what do you think the political underbelly may have been? Besides desegregation, do you think there was another agenda going forward on both
Well,
ends?
I think that the overall agenda in the 70s
Mhm.
was, white flight. So we could start probably there initially, and then it sort of branches off into other things. But white flight began to take place right as mandatory busing was deemed the law of the land in 1971.
Mhm.
So in 71, that's when the big push and the big migration of whites out of South LA and South Central LA began to occur. And they've all moved out to the valley, mostly Ventura, Burbank, the San Fernando Valley, and even Culver City area. And so they began to rally their troops, like the Roberta Weintraub and the Bobby Fielder, who later became a congresswoman, um, to say, hey, look, you know what? We don't like what we're seeing. We don't want our kids to go to schools with Black kids. If they feel like they're not getting, what they need, then the burden needs to be on them to come to our schools. And that's exactly what happened. So after Proposition 1 in 1979, and then it was finally ratified and enforced by 81, all that came to a halt with regards to whites going to Black schools. The